Chapter 6. Crime of the Decade. Church and State. State and Church. What does it mean to separate the two? Taken as a prescription, it is most probably an exhortation to not confuse the directions society should move with how a society gets there. The Church is there to make moral decisions about what is good and what is bad. Or in less absolute terms, it is there to reflect an average of all its constituents' opinions on morality weighted towards tradition. The state, on the other hand, is immoral and exists to ensure its own survival and execute as best it can the collective will of those it rules. How then do we bridge the gap? How do we make ourselves a religion that demands the state bend to its will and tolerates no other gods without falling utterly to corruption? How indeed? Benjamin Pryor.
Wilbur Mohem, Khan, is dead. Before me I saw a dozen reactions, large and small. Pained and pleased, but very few, not reflecting one extreme or another. Arthur Nym and I stood in front of the Star Chamber. The most powerful men in the greatest ark in the entire breadth of Christendom sat on their high benches and took in the news that we had come to share. At 0921 Trinity Standard, a scheduled backup integrity test was performed at Quantum Mentis Memoriam, a soul bank of good repute based on Adam Habitat. During this test, the mind and soul of one Damon Faulkner, feed persona and active participant in the Reclaimer movement, was found to be destroyed. A subsequent deployment at 0923 to Mestro Faulkner's residence revealed a second victim identified as Mark Thaler, a man of no special importance, who was initially thought to be a hooker of some type. A dive hollow was established at 2323 and subsequently at 0531. This morning it was revealed that Mark Thaler was an alias, and that the mind and soul occupying the body was that of Wilbur Mohem Khan, mayor of Esther Habitat.
A fucking mayor.
Jermaine didn't quite shout the words, but his strangled diction betrayed an immense desire to bellow.
Please tell me you are pulling my leg. Please tell me you are just playing a sick joke.
I shook my head. It's him, I said in a small voice. His ego is permeated with his office. I could feel it in the eye that I got.
We need to confirm this.
The deacon spoke with icy reserve, but I could see her quaking behind the facade. Even here in the boot lobby, with the low-resolution avatar that Sarah was wearing, her distress was obvious. I held up a hand for a moment and patched myself into the spine. A small window appeared in the air, filling with information and options. I paged quickly down into an obscure subroutine and input all of my most official credentials. George, Gamma Red, acknowledge. The interface with Trinity's arch-diamond pulsed a lurid crimson, and the dreaming face of the massive artificial intelligence swam into view.
Child of one, walker of 7th Street, buyer of cooked noodles. I acknowledge the sword of law in your hand, eager for the dance with Karen. I bleed sense. Are you treacherous, or is that not yet?
It was difficult to directly communicate with distributed intellects. They thought, but it wasn't really like the thoughts of a human being. Birds and helicopters both flew, but there were very few similarities aside from that. Normally, we would talk to a subroutine that would then translate our request into a language that George could understand, then fish up a response that made sense to us. I didn't have the option of working through a middleman. I needed the figments of what I knew to be directly loaded into the massive surveillance AI, and I needed her to review the available data with my intellect. For that, I needed to stick my head in the well, so to speak. Deacon Sarah, fuck her for being competent, was already spooling my mind link up to sync with George. Still, despite helping me in my preparation, Her expression was pinched and disapproving. Is there a problem? I kept my tone level, but a hint of challenge leaked into my voice despite my best efforts.
I should be doing this.
She spat the words. Oh!
This sort of demon interaction is solidly within my purview.
I snorted. There isn't a cop on this ark who hasn't honed interactions with George to an art. It's in all of our purviews.
I have more training, more specialization in this sort of affair.
Heat and emotion began to color her voice. There it was, the root of the problem. She didn't have to say it out loud. A silent, "I am better than you," echoed in the air between us with all the desperation and conviction of one who knows they are wrong, but hopes dearly against their best intuitions. I could not imagine a world in which Sarah and I could have been friends. But had I not been second generation, she might not have been my enemy. Yes, she was a stick in the mud. Yes, she was prickly to a fault. Yes, she was irrationally pious. And oh yes, was she proud? But she had never bared her fangs at my partner the way she had with me. Insecurity, thy name is Denise, Sarah. I turned very slowly towards the deacon and let her see the calm confidence in my eyes, the solemn and certain knowledge of my correctness. My cable is thicker, my brain is faster, and my dick is bigger. I paused and held her gaze. You know this. It is a matter of fact. You are not my equal. Her eyes flicked away from mine, flinching, but I didn't relent. She needed to understand our relationship. I snapped my fingers and pulled her eyes back to mine. This is serious. We don't have time to babysit your feelings. Results are the only thing that matters, so I think we can shove your purview where it belongs. With that, I turned away from the deacon. I frankly wasn't interested in extracting a full submission from her. I was done with the conversation, and I wasn't going to entertain any more of her bullshit. I took one deep breath, gave Jermaine a nod, then squared my shoulders and engaged the connection. The whirl blurred as the impressions the shard had left in my mind were translated into machine code, fed into the archdaemon, then echoed back into my mind. Back and forth, back and forth. Every arc had an archdaemon that was loaded into the basic hardware. Every citizen of the ark had the right and ability to flag suspicious activity for the attention of the monitoring intelligence. Reported crimes were investigated, and correct flags were used to grow the intelligence. Teach it to recognize suspicious activity, and then alert others whose purview was actual law to evaluate and perhaps intervene. George the Dragon Slayer was connected to the spine of the ark, and every camera, microphone, and sensor fed into her vast intellect. She had, over the 300 years of her existence, learned to effectively read minds, predict behavior, and suss out all manner of criminality. She was also incredibly dumb. She couldn't put two and two together without someone to hold her hand and walk her to a conclusion. Yes, she knew what a crime looked like. Yes, she understood suspicious behavior, but there was too much information, too many lines of reasoning to track. She was like an oracle. You could ask a question and get an answer, but she couldn't pose questions herself. George was a sea of answers waiting to be scooped out. I took all of my knowledge of the Damien Faulkner, Mark Thaler, the alias. I merged that with the information the dive had given us, and then I crossed that mess with the mayor of Esther, Wilbur Kahn. It was a confused jumble of impressions and emotions, but I held it in its entirety and showed it to the archdemon. It was like being 3 years old and walking through a museum by your mother. You were lost and confused, but absolutely certain that you wanted to see the dinosaurs. 10,000 perspectives. Each sluiced 10,000 hours of data across the lobes of my mind. George stood there moderating the flow, responding to my interests and queries. She would focus in on a stream, pull back, provide other nuggets of information that matched my desires. Slowly, like silt accumulating in the flow of a vast muddy river, an impression began to form. People hid from each other as a matter of course. We all had an instinctive desire for privacy. Just because every movement on the Ark was being monitored, this fundamental desire remained. Technology to fool and befuddle the station keeping AI was about as common as oxygen. Clothing that broke and refracted scanners, makeup that shattered pattern recognition algorithms, nanocides that changed skin color and facial features, shroud systems to bend light, and even swapping bodies at the most extreme. All these things and more were a regular fixture of our society. There was no hiding from God, but you had a legal right to give it your best shot. I saw a man in my mind's eye who wore a dozen different skins. George had noticed the little clues, but none of it had struck her as particularly sinister. So while she had logged the similarities, that tidbit hadn't piqued her interest enough to accrete a conclusion. My knowledge of a fundamental piece of the dead man's mind allowed me to fill in the gaps. My leaps of induction, combined with the Dragonslayer AI's suspicions, allowed new bridges to be formed, and all the pieces fell together. I pulled back from the AI, severing the linkage. The interface collapsed in a rush, and I was back in the dive chamber with the deacon and my partner. Had I been in my physical body, I would have gone weak in the knees. As it was, my stress was so great that my avatar was sweating. Part of it was simply the energy of that sort of mental workout required. Without the Dreamtime boost that the Deacon's team was funneling into the Hallow, there was no way I could have reached the temporal compression levels required to dance with a distributed intelligence. The other part was the hollow terror of how badly fucked this case was about to get. Deacon Sarah was off refusing to meet my gaze, pretending to be busy with some minutiae, but Germain was staring at me with an odd mixture of glee and dread. He was intuitive by nature, and he knew that I had something big to share. The fact that it was going to be a turd explosion mattered little to him. He would happily wade through a river of blood and fire for a worthy cause. I have a 7-point confirmation on the identity of the decedent. George has concluded that for the last year and a half Will Khan and Damien Faulkner have been engaged in a clandestine affair. Germain cackled, and the sound of it was rough enough that it managed to pull a goggle-eyed jump scare from Deacon Sarah.
Fucking Wilbur Mohammed Khan having a sinful little dalliance with his greatest political rival? This is too goddamn rich. This is going to be nuclear. Fucking. Apocalypse. The Reclaimers and the Expansionists are already at knives over the 68th Crusade, and this is going to mean blood in the streets.
A deep belly laugh shook Germain, and a maniac grin split his ugly face.
The entirety of Christendom is going to be set on fire from Eden to Nod, and all for the sake of this blasphemous piece of garbage and his twittering shitbag of a lover.
I couldn't help it but laugh. The whole situation was so fucked that laughing was the only sane option. The pressure-driven mirth caromed back and forth between us, and for a solid minute, Germain and I were racked with hysteria while the deacon looked on aghast. When I finally had my faculties under full control, I gave my partner a cheeky grin and waggled a finger at him. Now. The mayor was officially cleared of blasphemy charges, and it was proven that Wilbur's father divested himself of that name as well as made a full conversion before emigrating to this most holy land. Germain rolled his eyes, and when he spoke, it was with acid derision.
Wilbur Mohaim Khan is a pirate and a criminal, regardless of the fact that he managed to buy his way into office.
Has anyone ever been mayor of Esther without a rap sheet? I countered. That whole habitat is nothing but criminals, pirates, and utopians,
Doesn't mean we have to like it.
snorted Germain.
Wilbur Khan is a murderous pirate and a caliphite, and I will fuck myself with an iron rod before I give him an ounce of respect.
Wilbur Khan is a Muslim?
The deacon seemed to have found her voice, and her rank astonishment was startling. I thought everyone knew, at least in the constabulary. I shook my head. My animosity towards the deacon abated, even forgotten in the moment. Will Khan is no more a Muslim than he was anything. Still he wore the hat when it suited him. Helps when half your dealings are with new Meccan privateers. The throne disagreed that he should have such fluid loyalties, and he was brought up on charges about 15 years ago. Evidence was thin, rumors and hearsay mostly, but there was a key witness. Germain's face was a dark cloud as he continued my story.
Only thing was that this witness ended up having his soul eaten, along with 27 others in a supernal incursion out in the deep black while they were in transit to Ararat from the backwater colony Khan originated from.
He spat.
Bad luck, they said.
The Lord's judgment is slow, but Kamael has cast him out of Eden so we can rest easy. I clapped Germain on the back, and he gave me a darkly satisfied smile. I let out a quick breath. We have what we need, I said. Let's kick it up the ladder. Wilbur Mohaim Khan is dead. Fulvius Cardinal Judah, the most powerful man on the Ark, heard my words and leaned back in his chair with a tight smile on his lips. He looked to his left, and Cassius Cardinal Marius, the commander of the largest banner in the breadth, shared in his amusement. Theirs was not the only smiling face amongst the Star Chamber. Riley Archbishop Stubbs was almost giggling, but that was to be expected. As the head of the inquest on the Ark, her office's failure to capture Khan in the nets was an old wound, and a sore one at that. What was most surprising was that her arch-rival Flavia Archbishop Gladius was sharing her mirth. The two of them supposedly got on like wet cats in a sack, but I suppose that the arch-reverend would have to be pleased with the death of a heretic. Others were not so happy. Rashid Archbishop Mohinder predictably looked like he was about to have a stroke. I could imagine that he was imagining the loss of revenues from Esther as a result of the market instability the death of a competent mayor would cause. Cillian Macready, Archbishop of Law, was almost inscrutably amused, but there was a tiny tremor in his eyelid that my algorithms had pegged as simmering rage. The entire political arm of the Ark was all in a riot. As I spoke out the particulars of the case, I saw Javier Corrieda's already haggard visage crumble into a grey, flaccid wreck. Behind the eyes of the governor of Ark Trinity, I saw empires burn and civilization crumble to dust. The final destruction of his most powerful supporter was one thing, but that his death was a bizarre and shameful affair that would indelibly stain his name meant that I was delivering the eulogy of the governor's career. The remaining mayors ranged from green around the gills to flop sweat. The mayor of Joseph Habitat, Signa Walcott, had never been Will Khan's friend. In fact, to describe them as hated rivals would be a better choice. However, the assassination of her great adversary and the loss of Damien Faulkner One of her cousin's greatest proxies was at best mixed news. Her mouth was curled up in a twisted line, and it seemed she was fighting to hold in her nausea. Levine Alamain was similarly distressed, though perhaps for more personal reasons. Rumour had it that the mayor of Mary Habitat was deeply in bed with some of the more illicit activities that all the good citizens of Esther Habitat regularly engaged in. Auric Dine was handling it the best. Adam Habitat was famous for its relative political isolation, and Dine was few things strongly. For him, this was no great disaster and no great boon. Still, he was red around the collar and flinched with each new revelation. The problem with scandal on this scale was that in the ensuing investigation, you never knew what might be unearthed. And thus, we determined that Khan was posing as Mesothala and had been engaging in an extramarital affair with Mestro Faulkner for at least several years prior to this incident. Does the chamber have any questions? I spoke surely and without quavering. Normally I don't indulge, but for a pressure cooker of this magnitude I had made an exception. I was high as a kite. Chemically restrained, Nirvash had been tweaking my endocrine responses to produce a kind of hollow calm, and my Krynos gland was dumping its products into my blood at record speed. It helped me handle myself with grace, and gave a detached, almost clinical appreciation of the circumstance. I swept my head from left to right, seeking a hand or a noise, but the entire chamber seemed embroiled with internal communication. Not just the susurrus of whispered negotiation, but the air crackled with communication as the men and women of power contacted others and assessed the situation. The only exception came from the monastics. The grand abbots were all present, which was a surprise, really, but they were obviously uninterested. They had no power in the chamber by law, but they rated a seat in the observer's gallery. Daisuke St. Joseph was drawing something on a large pad of paper that seemed completely unrelated to the proceedings. Talia St. Ahmed and Willett St. Eigen were surreptitiously playing a game of catch, using various objects fished out of their pockets. They moved at unbelievable speed. I would see a slight blurring of one hand or another, and then a tiny pop as their chosen projectile broke the sound barrier. Both seemed to be thrilled by the audacity of their misbehavior, and were suppressing their mirth with limited success. It was like looking at a class of bored children. The Honourable Lady of Living Lighting Penny St. Tremaine was blatantly sleeping, and the ancient and powerful Alexander St. Walker, a man who literally could shatter the Ark with his own hands, was attempting with limited success to touch his nose with his own tongue. The high benches that were reserved for the Pantheon were empty. None of the Avatara had deigned to make themselves available to the chamber. Still, it was probably for the best. Creatures like Ulmos Carnivore, Bone-Weight Lover, and Ecstasia the Great Horned Worm were not the sort you wanted anywhere near you. I was about to return my eyes to the church polity when I realized with a start that I had been wrong. There was one shadowy figure high and away, leaning back in his seat. He was literally shadowy. The inky substance roiled around him and traced intricate designs on his skin. His eyes were flat black pools with no visible humanity. My eyes touched his, and with a jolt, I realized that he was staring at me, and had been for a while. A cold terror cracked the drug-induced calm that I had been relying on, and pure fear started to seep into my mind. No one in the chamber had cared to glance at me save this one. Why, oh why did it have to be this one? Ruin Blacksun was not just any member of the Pantheon. He was one of the three kings. My heart was thudding in my chest, and it was beginning to become difficult to breathe. I felt like I was being choked, and the animal panic was threatening to overwhelm my mask. I was being pulled into the past. I saw the angel of mercy reaching down with her bloody hands, and a sharp pain lanced through my forearm, and suddenly the past was gone. I went rigid, and then old training took hold. The algorithms of combat management cascaded through me. I checked my surroundings for threats as I inventoried myself for damage. There was no threat and no damage, only the empty regard of Ruin Blackson.
Inspector?
My head whipped around and met the gaze of Fulvius Judah. The Cardinal ex Trinity was a powerfully built man, carved out of stone and possessing a piercing mien.
In your professional estimation, who or what is the most likely culprit?
I cleared my throat and bought myself a quarter second to center myself again. A black monk of one type or another is the most likely murderer, but as for the culprit, we still are not certain who the primary target was. The Cardinal nodded. I could see him connecting the dots behind those steely eyes. He leaned back, apparently satisfied. Cassius Marius held up 2 fingers for Judah to see, then pointed at his palm and smiled. The Cardinal ex Trinity huffed a tiny laugh and shook his head ruefully. Some private joke, I assumed. The rest of the chamber seemed to quickly absorb my statement and return to their nattering. Most of them, at least. Not the monastics. In an instant, all the abbots were focused on me with a razor intent. Even the indolent Penny Saint Tremaine, who had seconds ago been fast asleep, had me pierced with a predatory gaze. It was a curious thing, though curious in a way that made my flesh crawl. They were considering, poised at the edge of a decision. Chicken or fish, red scarf or white, life or death. Alexander St. Walker was the one to voice the question, but it was all of them who were asking.
Who?
I huffed out a breath and made a small show of consideration, then gave them the usual suspects. Belinda St. Cushing ni Lockstam, Shinhan St. Tayusa ni Williams, and Roland St. Albrecht ni Marcus are the primary suspects in any local criminal execution. If it turns out to be a private feud or an out-of-town job, then we will have to consult with the inquest. 5 sets of eyes narrowed in unison. For 3 heartbeats, the Grand Abbots mused. Then Penny Saint Tremaine spoke.
Ezra St. Garrett is at your disposal. She will seek you out shortly. He will be your sword and shield should the need arise.
With that, the Grand Abbots immediately returned to indolence, foolishness, sketching, and their game of catch. I turned back towards the rest of the chamber and saw that my short interaction with the Grand Abbots had attracted the attention of quite literally everyone. The entire Star Chamber was once again focused on me, standing small at the center of the room. Cardinal Judah was the first to speak, and his tone was an even one, with only a hint of interest.
In addition to whatever support the monastics offer, know that I will have.
He paused slightly, his eyes flickering upwards. Dragon Slayer Team 6 on standby for your use. The rest of the magisterium seemed content to let this be their only statement on the matter, though a slight quirk in the left eyebrow of Riley Archbishop Stubbs indicated that the head of the local inquest would have private words for my boss before this was done. That was certainly not all that she would be doing. Her own inquisitors might involve themselves, but it was more likely she would pass this off to the Nosti Nullis. This wasn't a question of heresy, but politics, and the Church's secret police were the most likely agency to pick up the slack on this one. As for the civilian government of the Ark, they were all eyeing each other as much as they were eye-fucking me. I could see them trying to come up with questions that didn't indict them. Each of them had probably been in bed with Will Khan in one illegal or questionable manner or another, and they desperately wanted in on the investigation, while not letting anyone know exactly what they stood to lose.
We look forward to your continued good work on this most sensitive of cases.
The governor wasn't looking at me as he spoke. His eyes were fixed over my shoulder on DCS Nim.
Any help that is required, we will do our best to provide.
Singer Woolcott said, lying through her teeth.
My aide Timian Allred will contact you with the particulars.
Nirvash splashed a profile of Mestro Allred into my head, and it was all I could do to keep my displeasure off my face.
Absolutely.
Agreed Mayor Alamein.
We wish you the best and are at your disposal. To that end, I have assigned one of my best men to your side.
A new contact entry pinged into existence in my professional directory. A knot was growing in my stomach.
Inspector, know that the mayoralty of Ark Trinity is firmly in your corner.
Mayor Dines spoke those words as yet another useless political officer was strapped around my neck.
Good luck, Inspector, and go with the blessings of Michael.
Cardinal Judah seemed sincere when he spoke the words, but the merry crinkle in his eyes said he knew just how bad things were going to be for me.